So you touched a little bit on aerobic capacity, aerobic power. Can you talk to us about how you view energy system training and together with strength training? Because one could argue that they're kind of one and the same. We've made that separation at some point because it's probably easier for us to understand. But so how do you view those kind of separate blocks that seemingly work together?
Yeah, so tackling the energy system first, a lot of people are familiar with like a zone model of energy system training, maybe like a 3 zone model or a 5 zone or a 7 zone model. There's all different iterations. And the basic concept of zone models are at each progressive zone, you are increasing intensity. And the way that I view energy systems isn't fundamentally different, but instead of a zone-based model, it's a spectrum-based model. So on one side of the spectrum, we are primarily delivering oxygen, and on the opposite side of the spectrum, we're utilizing oxygen. So what we would actually see if I pop a Moxie monitor on someone's quad and we're observing muscle oxygen saturation at live time, let's say we get you and you hop on an assault bike and you're spinning nice and easy at maybe about 150 watts, you're going to be building up a reservoir of oxygen in your muscle. So you're over delivering oxygen and you start ramping up the intensity a little bit and you're going to deliver it a little bit slower over rate. We keep increasing your intensity. Maybe you're at like 325, 350 watts now. And now you're at the point where you're delivering and utilizing an equal amount of oxygen in the muscle. So the amount of O2 is just going to stay stable. And then we start pushing your intensity. And now you're utilizing more oxygen than you're delivering. And you start pulling oxygen out of the muscle at a very rapid rate until you're moving at a max intensity and you are utilizing far more oxygen than you're delivering. So the way that I would view training is on one side that spectrum, we would call it delivery or oxygenating work. You are delivering more O2 than you're utilizing. On the other side, we would call that utilization or deoxygenating training. Then anything in between that is going to be a spectrum. Where that ties into strength training is it's not that different. When we're doing strength training, if you're working at very low percentages of your 1 rep max, this varies person to person, but let's say a population level average, between about 0 to 30%, you'll be creating what's called compression reactions in the muscle. So you're basically creating these light contractions where you're squeezing a little bit of blood out of the muscle every time you contract, and then you relax and blood comes back into the muscle. And now we start contracting a little harder, and you're going to get what's called the venous occlusion reaction. For most people, this is about 30 to 70% of someone's 1 rep max. When you get venous occlusion, arterial blood is still entering the muscle, but venous blood isn't leaving. So when people talk about getting a pump, that's a venous occlusion. You're allowing all this blood to come into the muscle, but it's not escaping. You're getting this nice swelling effect. And then you keep increasing intensity, and eventually you'll cut off blood to the artery, which means no blood is entering the muscle, no blood's leaving the muscle. So on surface value, you're like, okay, the spectrum of oxygen delivery to utilization, I get that. That relates to energy system training. The spectrum of intensity of work inside the muscle during strength training, it makes sense. But how do we combine these things together? Well, the way that these relate is that our bodies only speak the language of tension and energetics. So my brain doesn't care whether I'm doing a set of front squats at 70% of my 1 rep max and I'm getting that venous occlusion in my quads, or it doesn't care if I'm rowing at 70% of my max top speed and I'm also cutting off blood flow and getting that venous occlusion in my quads. So for any activity that I'm doing, there's going to be a given level of tension and a given level of oxygen utilization in the muscle. So knowing that, we could kind of start to collapse the boundaries between strength and energy system training and see, oh, when I'm doing a set of front squats and I'm sprinting on the rower, if they're about equal levels of tension in the muscle and they're equal levels of oxygen desaturation, my brain's going to see those as the same thing. Our brain's not distinguishing between them because we are getting the same signals happening in the muscle, and our sensor proteins are detecting the same changes in calcium ions or glycogen or force or hormones. And then we're getting the same signal transduction process. And then we're going to get the same like effector processes that regulate gene transcription. And ultimately, that's what's going to dictate our adaptation to exercise.
And so how do you blend those into a training program, having that kind of new perspective on things? How does it work? Do you still qualify it as one or the other, or in your mind and on paper is it not that anymore?
Yes, so I take a very like physiology minded view when I'm looking at training. So even if I'm writing strength training into a session, I'm always thinking about, okay, I know what this is doing on the level of tension, but like what is this doing on an energetic level? When I'm doing this hypertrophy training, I'm desaturating the muscle and I'm creating hypoxia. So if I was planning on doing resistance training, then maybe doing some like threshold rowing repeats, I can't see those as two compartmentalized things. I think the classic mistake that I made and a lot of other people made in the CrossFit world is we would take these successful programs from the strength training world, like we would take like a Smolov squat cycle or Wendler's 531 or West Side, and then we would find like a Jack Daniels running program. And we're like, this works in isolation, this works in isolation. I'm going to smash those together. And what everyone found out when they did that is like 3 weeks later, you feel awful. Like it just doesn't work. And intuitively you're like, okay, it makes sense that this wouldn't work because both of these programs were written assuming there's a given amount of stress and recovery. But one of the other reasons why it doesn't work is that because those programs are fundamentally acting on the same systems. So the way that I think about training is like we have adaptation currency, and where are we spending this money? Strength training is pulling from the same budget as energy system training. So I'm always thinking about what is the physiological reaction that's occurring with the strength training? What is the physiological reaction with this energy system training? If we know what we're trying to get from each, we could better manage our budget, and then we could figure out how to lay out a training day, a training week, 2 training weeks, a cycle, and we could build those off of each other a little bit easier.
And so I guess you mentioned it a few times, working with the testing technology, the Moxie, amongst others. Can you talk a little bit about that technology and how it's changed your perspective on training?
Yeah, so anyone that's used the Moxie, one of the first things that you notice when you put it on is everyone does the same test. You pop it on your muscle, and then you just hop on a salt bike or row and you just haul ass for 30 seconds and you see what's going to happen. And the second you do that, the first thing you see is oxygen starts depleting rapidly. And the second oxygen bottoms out or hits 0%, you're screwed. Like, you just fall off the rower. You can't possibly improve performance. And the best you could do is hang on. And coming from more of like an academic science background, I was very familiar with bioenergetics and particularly a lot of those classic models. And I'm like, well, how does this make sense? I was taught that when I'm doing an activity like 0 to 2 seconds, you're primarily using ATP stores, and 2 seconds to 10 seconds, like this is immediate energy sources. I should primarily be using phosphagens, and the oxidative system shouldn't even be contributing to work until 2 minutes in. Yet the second I start sprinting, what do we see? Oxygen starts going down rapidly. So I'm like, this makes no sense. Like this monitor is like fucking broken. This thing doesn't work. And then inevitably, like after you get pissed off and you decide that this thing's a piece of shit, a few days later you come back around, you're like, I'm gonna try and understand why this is happening. And you start to find research that's contradicting those classic models, much like that path dependence example with the QWERTY keyboard. The same thing happens in energy system training. The classic energy system training models that most of us are familiar with from either like an XPhys background or reading super training or coaching manuals, that was created before we could practically measure most of the energetic processes that are happening in the muscle. But now we have all these technologies. We have near infrared spectroscopy, which allows us to measure oxygen being utilized in live time. We have nuclear magnetic resonance, which literally allows people to measure PCR being used on the level of milliseconds. And these technologies didn't exist when we came up with the models, but when we take into account these newer technologies and the research being done with them, it fundamentally changes the science of bioenergetics and how most coaches would look at it. And Moxie was my introduction to that. And now 5 years later, it's completely changed how I see training in every single way.